May 8th. Watch this video before the quiz and it'll help. The things on the quiz: graphs of sine and cosine, and finding the angles. So, first ones we're going to look at is graphing. I'll just do one of them. You can go back and look at some of the other videos on graphing if you want extra help. The important things that I could ask you on the quiz: what is the amplitude, what is the period, state the units that we're going to use on the graph, and the pattern, in this case for the cosine. The amplitude, remember, is always positive, never negative, and it's the absolute value of that coefficient. The period is 2 pi divided by the absolute value of b. Here's b right here. 2 pi over 2 is pi. To find the units, I just take that and divide by 4. So on my graph, I'm going to make each of these pi over 4 units apart. I'll get to that in a minute. Because this is a cosine, the pattern is max, 0, min, 0, max. That's my pattern. But because this has a negative, which is a vertical reflection, all my maxes become minimums, and all my minimums become maximums. All right, so I have everything I need to graph this, and my amplitude is 3, so I'll go up 3 units, I'll go down 3 units, and each mark on the x-axis, and you need to mark them, are pi over 4 units. And if I do this correctly, by the time I reach the 4th one, this should match the period. 1 pi over 4, 2 pi over 4, 3 pi over 4, 4 pi over 4, and so on. 5 pi over 4, 6 pi over 4, 7 pi over 4, 8 pi over 4, and in the negative direction, just these ones here with the negative sign: negative pi over 4, negative pi over 2, negative 3 pi over 4, and negative pi. If you don't put these on there, this graph doesn't mean a thing. We always start here on the y-axis, and on the y-axis I'm going to start at a minimum, and the minimum is the distance from the midline to the point that is 3 units away. That's my amplitude. So min, 0, max, 0, min. There's my 4th one, and it does match. I'm going to keep going. 0, max, 0, min. In the opposite direction, first one to the left would be at a 0, the next one's at a maximum, then 0, then a minimum. So here's the graph of this cosine curve with an amplitude of 3 with a reflection because that 3 is negative. And this graph goes on forever and ever and ever. Sort of like a sine, a sound wave or light wave. All right, so that's the first one, graphs of sine and cosine. I did a cosine. The only difference for a sine would be the pattern, and the pattern for sine is 0, max, 0, min, 0. Hopefully you remember that. All right, these next 3, I'm going to find the value of theta. What angle gives me this value, knowing that the cosine equals -1/2? You know, this thing right here I've done many, many, many times. This will help you answer these questions. I also put these quadrantals in because any time you see sine or cosine at 0, 1, or -1, it's one of these angles here, one of these quadrantals. Now, if the tangent's 0 or 1, that's not true. Okay, tangent is 1 at 45 degrees, and it's 0 at these two because it's sine over cosine. All right, so the first one. Where is the cosine negative? According to this chart, all seniors turn crazy. All of them are positive in 1. Only the sine is positive in 2. Only the tangent is positive in 3. And the cosine's positive in 4. Well, if the cosine's positive in 1 and 4, then it must be negative in 2 and 3, and that is true. So this will be quadrants 2 and 3. And I'm looking at this to figure out my reference angle. I know the cosine is 1/2 at an angle of 60 degrees. That just comes from those ordered pairs that we worked on. When is the x value 1/2? 60 degrees. And pi over 3 is the same thing as 60 degrees. Right, so for quadrant 2, how do we get to quadrant 2? Well, 180 minus the reference angle. So that would be 180 minus 60 is 120. So one of my answers is 120. In quadrant 3, now it's 180 plus the reference, so it would be 180 plus 60 is equal to 240. Now to find the radians, you could always just take these and multiply by pi over 180, or pi minus reference. So in quadrant 2, this would be pi minus pi over 3. Very easy way to do this is put the 3 on top and the bottom because that's still pi. So this would be 2 pi over 3. 240, it says pi plus reference. So pi plus reference would be 4 pi over 3. So the 2 degree measures, 120 and 240. The 2 radian measures, 2 pi over 3, 4 pi over 3, which makes sense. 240 is twice 120. 4 pi over 3 is twice 2 pi over 3. All right, so the next one, I notice this is positive. All of them are positive in 1. Where else is sign positive? Quadrant 2. So this is quadrant 1 and quadrant 2. And if you look at your ordered pairs again, sine or your y value square root 3 over 2 at 60 degrees, know that little chart, that will help, which is pi over 3. One good thing about quadrant 1, you don't have to do anything to find that measure, angle measure. Nothing. Don't have to do a thing. So 60 degrees, pi over 3, that's done. I got degrees and radians. Quadrant 2, again, it's 180 minus the reference and pi minus the reference. So 180 minus 60 is 120 degrees. And in radian measure, pi minus reference, well, pi